There was something about her that always seemed out of place, but no one could quite pinpoint what it was. Sarah Hartman arrived at the Larimer County Fire Department in Colorado on a cold October morning, carrying a battered backpack and a gaze that seemed to pierce through people before she even greeted them. She introduced herself as an outside consultant, hired by the department to evaluate safety protocols, but her quiet presence and the way she observed every move of the recruits suggested there was more to her than that. She wore simple clothes, always in dark shades, and kept her blonde hair tied back in a tight bun that revealed an irregular scar behind her left ear. When someone asked about her, Sarah deflected the question with an almost artistic skill. The recruits in the new class treated her with respectful cordiality, but there was an invisible distance she herself created. During training, Sarah stayed on the sidelines of the barracks, jotting things down in a worn notebook, occasionally asking technical questions that surprised her with their depth. Captain Delaney, a 23-year veteran, seemed to know her from somewhere, but never mentioned anything beyond basic instructions when they needed to interact. There was an unspoken tension between them, as if they shared a secret too heavy to be spoken aloud. The routine at the station continued as normal until the afternoon when one of the recruits, a young man named Marcus Webb, decided to test his limits. Marcus was 22 years old, with muscles developed from years of weightlifting, and an overconfidence that often put him in uncomfortable situations. During a building rescue simulation, he ignored the instructor's instructions and attempted a risky technique he had seen in online videos. The training structure began to sway dangerously, and panic ensued among the observers. That's when Sarah appeared. She strode across the space with long, decisive strides, climbed the structure with an agility that belied her unassuming appearance, and in less than 40 seconds, repositioned Marcus and stabilized the equipment before it completely collapsed. The way she moved left no doubt for any experienced observer. Those were not the movements of a management consultant. They were the reflexes of someone who had spent countless hours under real pressure, where mistakes cost lives. When she descended, Sarah said nothing, only wiped her hands on her trousers and returned to her observation post. But everyone in the room had noticed the change in the air. Marcus was shaken by the incident, but more intrigued than embarrassed. That night, while most of the recruits had left, he remained in the locker room searching on his cell phone. He typed in combinations of words that included Colorado firefighter, spectacular rescue, and blonde female firefighter. It was on an archived news page from 7 years ago that he found the first clue. A grainy photo showed a woman being carried on a stretcher, her face covered in soot, but with that same visible scar behind her ear. The headline read, "Firefighter survives collapse that killed 3 colleagues in Denver fire." The story recounted a fire in an old apartment complex in downtown Denver, where a team of 5 firefighters were trapped when the ceiling collapsed. 3 died instantly. 1 escaped with serious injuries. And then there was Sarah Hartman, 28 years old at the time, who was buried for 6 hours before being rescued, with a steel beam pressing against her left leg and toxic smoke filling the confined space where she was trapped. Doctors said she survived through sheer willpower and exceptional technical knowledge of oxygen conservation. Recovery took 18 months, including 7 surgeries on her leg and extensive treatment for psychological trauma. Marcus put the phone away, his hands trembling slightly. Everything made sense now. The way Sarah moved, that distant look, the tension with Captain Delaney. He didn't know exactly what to do with this information. Part of him wanted to confront her, to ask why she was hiding something so significant. Another part understood that some stories are kept secret precisely because they are too heavy to be shared freely. He decided not to say anything, at least not immediately. In the following days, Marcus began to pay closer attention to Sarah. He noticed how she avoided approaching the areas where they conducted simulations with real fire. He realized her hands trembled almost imperceptibly when the station alarm sounded, even if it was just a test. He saw how she closed her eyes for a second longer when the smell of smoke filled the air. These were small, but revealing signs of someone carrying an invisible weight. Compassion began to replace the intrusive curiosity Marcus had initially felt. The inevitable revelation came 3 weeks later, during a real call that would change everything. It was early November, and a cold front had brought strong winds that downed power lines in several parts of the county. A fire broke out on a rural property 40 minutes from the station, and all available units were mobilized, including recruits in the final stages of training. Sarah was in the office when the alarm sounded, and Captain Delaney, in a moment of questionable decision-making, asked her to accompany the team as a field observer. The scene they encountered was chaotic. A 2-story wooden house was completely engulfed in flames, and the family who owned it screamed desperately that their 7-year-old daughter was trapped on the 2nd floor. The wind complicated their efforts, scattering incandescent embers that started new fires every minute. Captain Delaney quickly organized the teams, but there was a critical problem. The main staircase had collapsed, and the structure was so compromised that a frontal entry would be suicidal. The recruits looked at each other, adrenaline mixed with paralyzing fear. Sarah stood beside the truck, her hands clenched into fists so tight her knuckles turned white. Her whole body was rigid, and anyone nearby could see the internal conflict unfolding in real time. She had spent years avoiding exactly this kind of situation, building a life where she wouldn't have to confront the demons the Denver tragedy had planted in her psyche. But now there was a child screaming for help, and every second of hesitation diminished her chances of survival. Marcus was close enough to hear when Sarah murmured something to herself, words that sounded like a prayer, or perhaps a plea for forgiveness for people who were no longer there to hear. Then, without warning anyone, she walked to the equipment, grabbed a full set of protective gear, and began to put it on with a speed that revealed preserved muscle memory, despite years away. Captain Delaney called her name, but Sarah was already in motion, assessing the structure with trained eyes, searching for the least compromising path. She chose a side route that no one had considered, using a narrow first-floor window that led to a corridor less affected by the fire. The way she moved was different now. There was no more hesitation, or the silent weight she carried on her shoulders daily. It was as if, by crossing that door, Sarah had left behind 7 years of fear and reclaimed the person she used to be. The recruits watched in stunned silence as she disappeared into the thick smoke. Inside the house, the heat was unbearable, and the smoke made visibility almost nil. Sarah moved by instinct and training, counting steps mentally, remembering the architectural plans she had reviewed days before as part of her assessment work. She found the back staircase, tested each step before putting weight on it, and climbed with methodical care, even knowing that every second counted. On the 2nd floor, she followed the child's muffled cries to a room in the corner of the hallway, where the girl was huddled under a bed, protected by an air cushion that wouldn't last much longer. Sarah picked up the child, wrapped her in her own protective coat, and began her descent. Halfway down the stairs, she heard the unmistakable sound of wood giving way, a noise her brain instantly recognized, bringing back flashback memories of the worst day of her life. Panic threatened to overwhelm, but she forced her breathing to slow, used techniques she had learned from her therapist, and focused solely on the child in her arms. When part of the ceiling began to collapse, Sarah used her own body as a shield, protecting the girl as debris fell on her back. The pain was instant and intense, but she kept moving, descended the last steps almost running, crossed the smoky corridor, and plunged out the side window, seconds before the entire 2nd-floor structure collapsed with a deafening crash. Marcus and another recruit were positioned outside and caught Sarah and the child as they practically flew through the opening. The girl was conscious, frightened but unharmed. Sarah had injuries to her back and shoulders, but nothing life-threatening. The silence that followed was broken by spontaneous applause from the family and firefighters present. Captain Delaney approached Sarah, who was sitting on the ground trying to catch her breath, and simply placed his hand on her shoulder without saying anything. There was no need for words. Everyone there understood what they had just witnessed. Not just a successful rescue, but the rebirth of someone who had been broken and had just proven that she was still whole where it truly mattered. Later, at the station, while the nurse tended to Sarah's superficial wounds, the recruits gathered in the hallway. Marcus finally shared what he had discovered weeks before, showing the old material on his cell phone. Reactions ranged from shock to profound admiration. Some felt foolish for having underestimated that quiet woman who observed everything from the shadows. Others understood for the first time the true meaning of courage, not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. Sarah emerged from the makeshift medical office and found the entire group of recruits waiting in the hallway. For a moment, she seemed poised to retreat, to return to the protection of the anonymity she had carefully cultivated. But then Marcus stepped forward, and without saying a word, extended his hand. It was a simple gesture, but laden with meaning, recognition, respect, gratitude. Sarah gazed at that outstretched hand for a long moment before accepting it. When she did, something shifted in her expression, an old tension finally beginning to dissolve. In the following months, Sarah became an integral part of the training program, officially, no longer a ghost observer, but a recognized instructor specializing in extreme rescue situations and post-incident psychological trauma management. She shared her experiences with brutal honesty, not romanticizing heroism, but explaining the raw reality of the fear, loss, and burden each firefighter carries when things go wrong. The recruits listened with reverent attention, understanding that they were receiving lessons that couldn't be found in manuals. Marcus, in particular, developed a deep respect for Sarah. He had entered training with the typical arrogance of someone who confuses physical strength with real preparation. Her presence, silent at first but profoundly impactful later, taught him that being a firefighter went far beyond muscles and techniques. It was about character, mental resilience, and the ability to make decisions under extreme pressure while carrying the weight of lives depending on you. Sarah embodied these qualities in a way that no theoretical lesson could convey. Captain Delaney finally explained the whole story one night when everyone was gathered after a particularly difficult shift. He had been the commander in the Denver fire. 7 years earlier, the man who made the decisions that led that team into the building. 3 of his best firefighters died that night, and Sarah almost joined them. Guilt had consumed Delaney for years, and when Sarah reappeared wanting to work again, even indirectly, he accepted because he felt he owed her that. But he also feared what might happen if she were forced to confront her traumas before she was ready. The girls' rescue changed that dynamic. Sarah had proven to herself, more than to anyone else, that the fire no longer controlled her. The trauma would always remain. Psychological scars don't completely disappear, but she had regained the ability to choose how to respond to it. She was no longer a victim paralyzed by memories, but a survivor who had transformed suffering into wisdom and fear into renewed purpose. When Marcus's class graduated 6 months later, Sarah was in the front row of the ceremony. She wasn't wearing her official uniform, but her name was mentioned during the speeches as a key influence in shaping that generation of firefighters. Marcus, who received a medal for exceptional performance, dedicated the achievement to her during his brief acceptance speech. Sarah accepted the recognition with a discreet nod, never comfortable with public attention, but also no longer shying away from it as before. The Larimer County Fire Station developed a reputation in the following years as having one of the most rigorous and psychologically prepared training programs in the state. Much of this was credited to the methodologies Sarah implemented, combining impeccable technique with careful attention to the mental health of the firefighters. She established debriefing protocols after traumatic incidents, created peer support systems, and most importantly, normalized conversations about fear and vulnerability in a profession where admitting weakness was traditionally seen as a character flaw. There were difficult moments, of course. Nights when Sarah woke up covered in cold sweat, reliving the sound of that collapsing ceiling in Denver. Days when the smell of smoke hit her the wrong way, and she needed to step away, breathe deeply, remind herself that she was safe. But those moments became less frequent over time, and when they did happen, she had built a support network that helped her through them. Captain Delaney became a true friend, someone who understood the weight without needing explanations. Marcus and other recruits from that group kept in touch, periodically checking on how she was doing. Sarah's legacy spread beyond that specific station. Other departments began inviting her to give talks and workshops, interested in learning about her methods of integrating technical preparedness and psychological resilience. She accepted selectively, still protecting her energy and setting clear boundaries on what she could share. There was no interest in becoming a celebrity or spokesperson, only in using her experiences to make a tangible difference in the lives of other firefighters. The house that had burned down that November day was rebuilt by the family, and they kept in touch with Sarah for years. The girl she rescued, named Emma, grew up admiring firefighters and eventually followed a similar path, becoming a paramedic. In a letter she sent to Sarah when she turned 18, Emma wrote that she didn't remember many details of that terrifying day, but she clearly recalled the feeling of safe arms around her and a calm voice saying that everything would be all right. That memory, Emma said, had shaped her decision to dedicate her life to helping others. Sarah kept that letter in a special drawer in her desk, along with photos of the colleagues she lost in Denver, not as symbols of tragedy, but as reminders of why the work mattered. Every life saved, every firefighter properly trained, every honest conversation about the psychological costs of the profession. All of this was part of honoring those who didn't return home on that terrible day. She carried their memories not as a burden, but as a responsibility to make their deaths mean something beyond statistics in official reports. Years after the rescue that revealed her identity, Sarah still worked at the Larimer County Station, now officially as an advanced training coordinator. Her office had a window overlooking the drill yard, where she watched new classes of recruits go through the same simulations she had once mastered, then lost, and eventually regained. The scar behind her ear remained visible, as did the slight limp in her left leg on cold days. They were permanent marks, but also testaments to survival and resilience. Marcus, now a veteran firefighter with 5 years of service, would sometimes bring new recruits to meet Sarah in person. He would tell the story of this quiet woman, whom no one had initially noticed, and how she had saved not only a child, but also taught them all the true meaning of courage. The eye. Rookies listened, fascinated, many of them later seeking out Sarah for conversations that went far beyond firefighting techniques, conversations about fear, purpose, and how to keep going when the world seems to have crumbled around them. Sarah's transformation from ghost observer to respected mentor wasn't dramatic or sudden, but happened gradually through countless small interactions. A word of encouragement here, a piece of technical advice there, a constant presence that told recruits that someone who had been through the worst was there, standing firm and functional, proving that it was possible to survive the storms that the profession inevitably brings. She became exactly what she had needed most during her own darkest moments, living proof that trauma doesn't mean the end, and that real heroes are those who keep getting up even when every fiber of their being begs to stay lying safe. The routine at the station took on a comforting rhythm for Sarah in the years that followed. She would wake up every morning at 5:30, brew strong coffee in the small kitchen of her apartment 3 kilometers from the station, and drive through the still empty streets of Larimer as the sun began to tinge the Rocky Mountains with golden hues. There was a peace in those solitary moments that she had learned to appreciate, a time to organize her thoughts, before facing the day full of responsibilities and human interactions that, however meaningful, still drained her energy in ways that few people fully understood. The office she occupied was modest, with walls covered in training certificates, topographical maps of the region, and a few carefully selected photographs. One showed her old Denver team, taken 3 weeks before the fatal fire, all smiling after a successful rescue. Sarah didn't avoid looking at that image, but she didn't look at it daily either. It was there as part of her history, neither glorified nor hidden, simply existing as a testament to a chapter that had shaped who she had become. The recruits who went through her program came from diverse backgrounds. There were ex-military personnel seeking purpose after leaving active service, young people fresh out of college motivated by genuine idealism, some who followed family legacies of several generations of firefighters, and others who simply sought a career where they could make a tangible difference in the world. Sarah treated everyone with the same respectful seriousness, recognizing that each person carried their own reasons and fears, their own abilities and limitations. She had developed a particular method for identifying which recruits possessed not only physical ability, but also the psychological makeup necessary for the profession. It wasn't about eliminating those who showed fear. On the contrary, Sarah deeply distrusted candidates who claimed to fear nothing. Fear was a survival tool when properly calibrated. What she sought was the ability to function under pressure, the skill to make quick decisions with incomplete information, and above all, a willingness to prioritize the safety of others over individual heroic impulses that often caused more harm than good. Marcus became a sort of informal assistant, helping Sarah with practical demonstrations and sharing perspectives from someone who had recently gone through the same training. He had matured significantly since that arrogant young man who had almost caused a disaster in the simulation years ago. Now there was thoughtfulness in his actions, an awareness of consequences that came from real experience facing situations where wrong decisions were costly. Sarah saw in him a reflection of what she hoped to achieve with all recruits, the transformation of raw enthusiasm into refined competence. There was one particular incident that cemented Sarah's reputation among Colorado firefighting circles. A recruit named Jennifer Torres was experiencing extreme difficulties with claustrophobia during confined space rescue drills. Her reaction was visceral and uncontrollable. Hyperventilation, panic, and a complete inability to perform basic tasks when placed in tight spaces. Most instructors would have disqualified Jennifer immediately, deeming that phobia incompatible with the requirements of the profession. Sarah approached it differently. She recognized something of herself in Jennifer, someone with exceptional abilities hampered by specific psychological trauma. Instead of summary elimination, Sarah proposed a gradual desensitization program, working with Jennifer in private sessions, where she progressively exposed her to increasingly confined spaces, always with clear escape routes and total control over the process. It took 4 months of intensive work, but eventually Jennifer overcame her phobia sufficiently to complete the training. She never became completely comfortable in tight spaces, but she developed tools to manage anxiety and function appropriately when necessary. That patient and psychologically informed approach set Sarah apart from traditional instructors. She understood that trauma was not a weakness of character, and that with appropriate methods, many apparent limitations could be overcome or managed. This did not mean lowering standards. Sarah was rigorous about the minimum competencies required, but it did mean recognizing that paths to achieving those competencies varied among individuals, and methodological flexibility often produced superior results. Compared to uniform and rigid approaches, Captain Delaney retired as Sarah completed her 5th year as an official instructor. The ceremony was emotional, with firefighters from across the region attending to honor a man who had dedicated 3 decades to service. During his farewell speech, Delaney specifically mentioned Sarah, calling her one of the bravest people he had ever known, not for a single day's spectacular action, but for her daily courage in confronting personal demons while helping others avoid the same ones. The words were simple, but laden with shared meaning, and Sarah accepted the recognition with a discreet nod from the audience. The new captain was a woman named Rebecca Osman, a 15-year veteran transferred from a large station in Denver. Rebecca knew Sarah's reputation and immediately sought to establish a collaborative partnership. They discovered a natural affinity. Both had faced their own challenges in a still predominantly male profession. Both valued psychological preparation as much as physical, and both shared a vision that fire departments needed to evolve beyond traditional cultures that often ignored the emotional costs of the job. Under Rebecca's leadership, the station expanded its mental wellness programs, implementing regular psychological debriefing sessions, creating peer support groups, and establishing partnerships with therapists specializing in occupational trauma. Sarah was instrumental in designing those programs, contributing perspectives from someone who had personally experienced both the failures and successes of different treatment approaches. She spoke openly about her own therapy sessions, normalizing the search for professional help, and dismantling old stigmas that labeled emotional vulnerability as weakness. The results were measurable. Retention rates increased significantly, with fewer firefighters leaving the profession prematurely due to burnout or untreated trauma. Incidents of substance abuse and family problems related to occupational stress visibly decreased. Larimer's station began to be studied by academic researchers interested in effective models of psychological support for high-stress professions. Sarah participated in some of this research, contributing data and insights, but always carefully protecting specific details of individual cases. Emma, the girl Sarah had rescued years before, visited the station as she was finishing her paramedic training. She was a confident 16-year-old now, with the same dark hair and determined eyes that Sarah remembered from that terrifying day. Emma hadn't come seeking a dramatized emotional encounter, but simply to thank her personally and share that she had chosen her career directly inspired by that moment. They talked briefly, Sarah offering some practical advice on dealing with the stress of emergency medicine, and then Emma left. It was a simple but deeply satisfying encounter, tangible confirmation that terrible day had produced at least one unequivocally positive consequence. Marcus was eventually promoted to lieutenant, taking on supervisory responsibilities for response teams. He frequently consulted Sarah on aspects of leadership, especially related to how to identify signs of extreme stress in his subordinates, and how to approach difficult conversations about personal limitations. Sarah appreciated these consultations because Marcus genuinely listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak, but absorbing advice and applying it judiciously. Seeing someone she had helped train now developing his own leadership wisdom brought a sense of legacy that Sarah had never imagined she wanted, but found to be deeply rewarding. There were failures, inevitably. Some recruits Sarah invested significant time and simply couldn't complete the program, discovering that the profession didn't match their abilities or temperaments. Sarah learned not to internalize those results as personal failures. Part of effective training was helping people recognize their own limitations before real-life situations revealed them in potentially fatal ways. Better to discover incompatibility during controlled simulations than in burning buildings with lives depending on you. A veteran firefighter at the station, a 52-year-old man named Don Richter, began showing signs of accumulated trauma after 3 decades of service: frequent nightmares, increasing irritability, dissociation during calls, all classic symptoms that Sarah recognized immediately. Don initially resisted seeking help, stuck in outdated mindsets about masculinity and strength. It was Sarah who finally managed to break through those defenses, not through confrontation, but by sharing her own experiences in therapy, admitting that she still had difficult days, normalizing the idea that even the strongest need support sometimes. Don eventually sought treatment and, after a few months of intensive therapy combined with adjustments to his responsibilities, was able to end his career with dignity instead of collapsing under the weight of decades of unprocessed trauma. He thanked Sarah personally on the day of his retirement, saying that she had probably saved his life as truly as she had saved Emma's in that fire years before. Sarah accepted the thanks with genuine humility, understanding that saving lives took many forms, some dramatic and visible, others silent and private, but no less significant. Sarah's personal life remained relatively private. She had a few close friends outside of work, kept in regular contact with her sister in another city, and occasionally went out for dinner or hikes in the mountains. There was no serious romantic relationship, something some colleagues discreetly questioned, but Sarah never felt the need to explain. Her life was complete in ways that mattered to her. Loneliness and being alone were different things, and Sarah had learned to distinguish between them. She had enough meaningful connections to satisfy her social needs without burdening herself with more than she could handle emotionally. When Sarah completed a decade of service at the station, Rebecca organized a small recognition luncheon. It wasn't a grand celebration, just the core team gathered to share stories and express appreciation. Marcus gave a short speech mentioning how many active duty firefighters owed their careers to Sarah's training and mentorship. Jennifer Torres, now a competentee and respected firefighter, shared how Sarah had refused to give up on her when everyone else had. Don Richter, who had come especially for the occasion, spoke about how Sarah had changed the station's culture to one that recognized the full humanity of the people they served. Sarah listened to those testimonies with mixed emotions. Part of her still felt uncomfortable being the center of attention, but another part, larger now than years ago, recognized that accepting recognition was a way to honor not only her own work, but also those who helped her get to where she was. Her therapist, the colleagues who patiently supported her during recovery, the recruits who trusted her when she was still rebuilding her self-confidence, all were part of that story. When it was her turn to speak, Sarah kept her words simple, thanking everyone for making the station a place where vulnerability and strength could coexist, where people could be broken and mended and still remain effective and valuable. Later, as Sarah drove home that afternoon, she allowed herself to reflect on the entire journey. 10 years since that first day she arrived at the station like a silent shadow carrying invisible weight. Years marked by gradual progress, some setbacks, many moments of doubt, and some of crystal clarity. She thought of the 3 colleagues she had lost in Denver, whose names she still silently uttered on certain anniversaries. She thought of the girl Emma and the woman she was becoming. She thought of Marcus, Jennifer, Don, and countless others whose lives had intertwined with hers in unexpected ways. The scar behind her ear was still there, visible when she tied her hair back. Her left leg still ached on cold days. Nightmares still visited occasionally, though less frequently now. Sarah wasn't the same person she had been before the Denver fire. That woman had died under those rubble. But the person who had emerged from the ashes, literally and figuratively, had found herself capable of things the previous version had never imagined. Not just surviving, but building something meaningful from the fragments. Not just functioning despite the trauma, but using that experience to help others avoid or navigate their own journeys through the darkness. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in spectacular oranges and purples, Sarah felt something that took her years to recognize as peace. Not the absence of pain or scars, but but the quiet acceptance that both were part of who she was. The firefighter she used to be, the survivor she had become, the mentor who had developed her skills, all were versions of the same person, finally integrated into a coherent narrative where tragedy and purpose coexisted without contradiction.